Our second presenter is Dr. Long, Adam Long. Dr. Long is the executive director of the Arkansas State University's heritage sites. That includes the historic Dice Colony, which is the Johnny Cash boyhood home, the Lakeport Plantation, the Southern Tenant Farmers Museum, and the Rower Japanese American Relocation Center, plus the VCK's house. Dr. Long has a BA in English from Lyon College, a master's degree in American literature from the University of Arkansas, and a PhD in American literature from the University of Kansas. He has previously served as the director of the Hemingway Pfeiffer Museum in Piggott, Arkansas, and has taught classes in English and heritage studies at the Arkansas State University. He has published in the Hemingway Review and the Faulkner Journal and Philosophical Review, and has authored chapters on both Ernest Hemingway and William Faulkner. His topic is Delta Agricultural History and the Arkansas State University Heritage Sites. He will talk about the way those heritage sites present an overview of the development of agriculture in the state of Arkansas, as each one of those heritage sites has a history of agricultural development to speak of. For example, cotton agriculture at the Lakeport Plantation, which started in the 1830s and continues into today, provides an overview of major stages of agriculture in the Delta, from enslaved labor to modern mechanized farming.
All right, thank you very much, and thank you for having me this morning, for coming out on a Saturday for the symposium. Today I'll be talking about the Arkansas State University heritage sites, and particularly how those four sites taken together tell the story of agriculture in the Delta. Particularly in the way it relates to one story, one particular story of struggle, which is the response to the Great Depression and the New Deal in Arkansas. So each of the four sites that ASU operates in the Delta have this shared story. We have a lot of other stories too. We talk about Johnny Cash and Ernest Hemingway and others, but they're all connected by the story of what happened in the Delta during the Great Depression. So the picture on this first slide is not one of our sites. This is a picture of the university when it was the First District Agricultural College, and it shows that at the time that our sites were not sites, were privately owned places that were doing all the things we were going to talk about, that the university was already involved with the agricultural history of the Delta. And I think that helps to answer the question of why it is the university has heritage sites, right? Is that we've always been involved in the agricultural heritage of the Delta. But we also exist because we have a Heritage Studies PhD program in which our sites can serve as laboratories for students that can either work with us long-term as a GA or on individual projects. So this is a kind of small, but a map of where our sites are located. So you can see the blue star where Jonesboro is, where we are here on campus. At the top of the map, the very northeast corner there, the Hemingway Pfeiffer Museum, is our oldest site and our furthest north. And I'll go through these in just a second and tell you more about them. But then coming down, the Johnny Cash boyhood home and the Southern Tenant Farmers Museum are in Dice and Tyronza, and those are about 15 minutes apart there, just east of Jonesboro. And then at the very south of the state, we have the Lakeport Plantation Museum in Lake Village, Arkansas. And these 4 sites are connected by National Scenic Byways. We have the Crowley's Ridge Parkway, which the university maintains, and then we have the Arkansas's portion of the Great River All-American Road, which is a 10-state National Scenic Byway that a state commission takes care of. Okay, so what I would like to do is go through our sites, tell you a little bit about how they fit in with that agricultural heritage of the 1930s. And then with the last site, I'd like to really kind of zoom in on it in a little more detail, okay? With these, I'm going to be moving not as they are on the map, but as they make sense in the story, okay? So Lakeport Plantation is located in Lake Village, Arkansas, which is right across the river from Greenville, Mississippi, in the far southeast Arkansas. It has been in continuous cotton production since 1831. And it has seen every type of cotton production that has been used in the Delta, and continues to be farmed now. So at Lakeport, what we have is an overview of the story of agriculture. So it started in 1831. The Johnson family farmed the land, and a son of that family, Lycurgus Johnson, would build a plantation there and ran the plant. Oh, thought I had another slide. Sorry about that. Ran the plantation, of course, on enslaved labor before the Civil War, and then following the Civil War, transitioned into the center of a sharecropping operation. Then in the 20th century, the plantation was purchased by the Sam Epstein family that continued to farm it throughout the 20th century, and they continue to farm it now. It's about 65,000 acres there, but of course now they're using modern mechanized methods. The university owns the house, an educational center, some outbuildings, but other than that, the Epstein Angel family continues to farm around the house. You can see how close they get to the house there. That's a fairly recent picture, right? So Lakeport has the overview of agricultural heritage, and then we zoom into the 30s, to the Great Depression, and how Arkansas responded to all of the failed farms during the Great Depression, right? And each of our 3 sites in northeast Arkansas show a different response to that crisis. The first is the Hemingway Pfeiffer Museum in Piggott, which shows a private response to the crisis. So the Pfeiffer family moved to Piggott they started buying land in 1910 and moved in 1913. They moved from St. Louis and had actually grown up in Iowa, so they brought in with them Midwest ideas of how to run a farm and what it should look like and that sort of thing. And so they didn't inherit the plantation system and just convert it into sharecropping. Their tenant farming setup was much more generous to the farmers. It allowed farmers to be paid to be paid in cash and buy their goods wherever they wanted to. The Pfeiffers didn't own a company store or a commissary that kept their farmers in debt to them. They were generous in their loan policies throughout the Great Depression, making sure that instead of losing the farms, farmers were able to keep them. On the day that all of the banks crashed in Piggott, which was a little bit, a few weeks after they had crashed nationwide. Mr. Pfeiffer restarted or founded a new bank the next morning after the bank crash, so that there was never a credit crisis for farmers in Piggott. And those are just a few examples, but after the Depression in the 1940s, when the Pfeiffers began selling off the land because Mr. Pfeiffer was looking to retire, the families that were farming the land, 75% of them were able to purchase their land from him up front with cash out of their savings. And then of the remaining 25%, about 70% of those were able to pay off their mortgages in 3 years, right? So that's a lot of savings in the economy of a small town coming after the Depression. And also, a bit unusual that he offered to sell it to them instead of to another major landholder or land company or something like that in the first place. The fact that he let these family farms start. So we have here some pictures of the Pfeiffers during the period. That's their home there. That is now the main building of the museum there in Piggott. That's Paul and Mary. There next to the home, and then below that they have some relatives from out of state admiring the fields. The book I have there at the bottom is called Pfeiffer Country, and I put that up there because it's an example of student research. It's in fact probably some of the earliest student research involved with our heritage sites. This was started as a dissertation, but then was later published. Pfeiffer Country, it's about the Pfeiffers' farm practices during the Depression, taking some of the records that remained there, both at our site and then in the county records, and looking at the way that they operated their farms and how that was distinct from what other owners were doing in the area. So I put that up there. That was an early example, but this is the kind of ongoing research that happens at our sites, and one of the reasons that the university continues to be involved with them. I should say before we get on to Dice that the Pfeiffers, their oldest daughter married the American author Ernest Hemingway, and he was a regular visitor there in Piggott in the 1920s and 30s, and wrote portions of A Farewell to Arms and some of his well-known short stories there. The family converted the barn behind the house into a studio for him. So Hemingway certainly serves as a draw for people who will know the name Hemingway and want to know that story, and so we'll come for those reasons. And we do, of course, talk about Hemingway and his history with the site, but we use that as a hook to get people interested in talking about Arkansas and about the Pfeiffer family, whose story is very interesting as well. So. If you come and visit the museum, you can visit the Pfeiffer family home and learn about them, but we also have the studio that Ernest wrote in as open to the public, and do things like writers' retreats and author signings and those sorts of things as part of our programming there. Okay, so the Pfeiffers represented a private response to the Great Depression. Right? They did it through the way they chose to run their company in ways that helped and benefited the community. Right? The historic Dice Colony represents a federal response to the Great Depression. Dice was founded in 1934 as a resettlement colony by the Federal Emergency Relief Association, which became the WPA, the Works Progress Administration. It was designed for farmers in Arkansas, or for families in Arkansas who were out of work or whose farms had failed. They could apply to move to Dice, where they would have a 20-acre farm that they would essentially rent from the federal government with the expectation that through their crops they would be able to pay back over the years that it would become their home. DICE was set up for 500 families. Ultimately, it had 487 families actually ended up in DICE. There were some places by the river that flooded too much, ended up not working out. But 487 families, only Arkansans, but all 75 Arkansas counties were represented there at DICE. You can see in these pictures, the top picture is the federal, the administration building for the federal project. There on that circle is kind of where some of the office buildings and central services of the colonies are. And then the bottom picture is what a typical colony house looked like. And that house is the house that Ray and Carrie Cash would move into, and their son J.R., who would later take the stage name Johnny, grew up there. He moved when he was 3 years old, graduated high school there, and so again, just like Hemingway, the Johnny Cash connection brings a lot of people in. But while they are there, we talk to them about the federal project there at DICE. So you can see kind of a map. I know you can't see it well, but it gives you kind of an idea of how the colony was laid out with those 500 farmsteads. And some of the construction work there so the colony was started in 34. Most people moved in 35. Work crews would go through on those 20-acre farms, and they would clear an acre or so and build a house on it. And then when you moved in, your house and the area around it was completed, but you had to clear the rest of the acreage and then, plant and make it productive. The federal administration building is there on the top, and then their bottom right is Eleanor Roosevelt, who came for the dedication of the colony, which wasn't held until 36. And DICE, in addition to being an agricultural colony, it also was an experiment in a bunch of collective services, right? There were a bunch of socialized services in DICE. So there was a school and a hospital, but there was also a cannery, various factories over the years, a mattress factory, a toy factory, a china factory. There was a home economist who would recommend how people should clean their houses and decorate them, and, personal hygiene and these sorts of things, right? So it was more than just, getting the farm. It was also a community with all of these experiments in, collective living, right? Ultimately, many of these farms would survive outside of the Depression, but a lot of the other collective services went away, in the 40s. This is just some shots of what the colony looked like when ASU got involved. We now have 2 buildings. Well, we now have 3 buildings on the colony circle. 2 of them are open to the public. The old theater building that you see there on the top is now a visitor center, and then that administration building, which you see there in the background of the theater building, is a museum about DICE and about the New Deal project there. Now, if you come to DICE, you can also take a guided tour of the restored Johnny Cash boyhood home, right? So the stuff there in the circle, in the administrative center, is about the New Deal project, and then we tell the Cash family story out at the home. I don't have it pictured here, but last year we also on the building on the other side of the theater that you can't see, but roughly where the photographer is standing, we were able to restore that building and open it as our archive building, which we hope will be another research opportunity for people. DICE is is interesting in that since it was a federal colony, they kept lots of records, right? And so and we have also pretty thorough newspaper records from the colony and newsletters and photos and those sorts of things. So it's a very interesting collection about rural life during the Depression. And then some pictures of the restoration ongoing and after it was complete. As I mentioned, the boyhood home of Johnny Cash, you can see his house there. You know, we use the Cash story to connect people to the larger story. And it's great because Johnny Cash regularly talked about dice throughout his career. This wasn't a, you know, somebody slept here kind of thing, but he identified with dice and regularly mentioned it, and that's great at drawing people in. The black and white picture there on the bottom right is him and June returning later on in the 70s, I believe that is. You can see the restoration work we did there. The top right picture, you'll see the ground dug out. The soil in Dice is gumbo soil, right? But it's hard. It's rich if you can farm it, but it's hard because it becomes so mucky when it's wet that you get stuck in it, and then when it's dry, it cracks open. And so, in order to make the restoration long-lasting, these wooden houses, the foundations shift on that soil over time. So what we had to do was remove so many feet of soil, bring soil in from the outside, and replace the house on that so that the foundations wouldn't shift anymore. It's one of the more interesting challenges we had in the restoration. The Cash family has been very involved with the restoration. Johnny's two youngest siblings, Joanne and Tommy, are still living and have great memories of the house and had been very involved with helping us, you know, both get the look of the inside of the house correct, but then also sharing their own oral histories and stories of the house, right? So they've been a great resource. But then the family has also used their connections to help us hold the Johnny Cash, originally the Johnny Cash Music Festival, now the Johnny Cash Heritage Festival, which has served as a fundraiser for the project to do the restoration. We did 4 years of a music festival in the First National Bank Arena before the restoration was complete as a fundraiser for that. And then once the restoration was complete, we moved the festival out to Dice and made it a 3-day festival called the Johnny Cash Heritage Festival that's now held at Dice. But the family, you can see some of the names we've had there, and those have been thanks to the Cash family's involvement and connections. And just a couple of quotes from Johnny Cash about Dice. Back in Arkansas, a way of life produced a certain kind of music. The music carried me up above the mud, the work, and the hot sun. I'd ended up in the military the same way most other Southern country boys did, for lack of a better way out of the cotton fields. And then every inch, and he's talking about Dice here, so every inch of that place made me think of something different, something wonderful and precious that happened. So I guess maybe the point here is, you know, I've been saying we take the Johnny Cash story and use that to get people interested in the bigger story. But I think that's a little bit unfair, because I think the point that Cash is making is the same story, right? They may be familiar with the Johnny Cash name, but that story of Dice is what influenced his music, what influenced his childhood and that sort of thing. So it's not just it's expanding the story, but it's not just a bait and switch, right? It's the same story. Okay, and now our last site, and the one that I wanted to maybe zoom in on just a little bit more than the others, is the Southern Tenant Farmers Museum, which is in Tyronza, Arkansas. Okay, so if the Hemingway Pfeiffer Museum represents a private response, and the Historic Dice Colony represents a a public response, a federal response. The Southern Tenant Farmers Museum represents an organized labor response, okay? And it's the story of a union of sharecroppers and tenant farmers that started in Tyronza in 1935. It is a union that had both white and black members from the beginning. It was voluntarily integrated from the beginning and had both women and men in leadership roles in the organization in the 30s. So just to kind of go back and talk a little bit more about how we got there, why the union was necessary, right? We can look at a little bit of this history that we talked about at the other sites and at, say, Lakeport, which did rely on the plantation system and on enslaved labor, right? So prior to the Civil War, Arkansas Delta was mostly cotton economy dependent on enslaved labor. Following the Civil War, sharecropping, tenant farming replaced that, okay? But it also replaced it in a way where those sharecroppers and tenant farmers were still de facto unable to leave the plantations, right? Often these sharecropping and tenant farming operations didn't leave. They still ran out of the same house and still ran by the same people, right? So the terms kind of changed, but in many ways not all that much changed. In fact, one of the things we have at Lakeport is in the back part of the house is the sharecropping era company store, where the sharecroppers would still come into that plantation house and get their goods there in what had been just some sort of commissary where you could check out stuff. Well, now they would buy them, but they would buy them on terms where they stayed always in debt. Right? The difference generally between sharecropping and tenant farming is tenant farmers generally owned their tools and their animals, okay, whereas sharecroppers rented everything from the landlord, okay? Because of that, sharecroppers generally paid more of their crops for rent, and tenant farmers paid a little bit less because they brought some of the supplies they needed with them. Both tended to leave you trapped in debt, but tenant farming was technically a little bit better off than sharecropping, though terms of all of these contracts differed from place to place, and so it's a generalization. So the sharecropping system led to a response, often a violent response in the South. So, for instance, there was in 1891 in Lee County, Arkansas, there was a strike, a cotton pickers strike, that was then put down violently by the landlords, who the cotton pickers were striking for higher wages per bale, per pound picked, and the landlords violently broke that up instead of paying more, right? The example of this that I'm sure you've all heard of is the 1919 Elaine Massacre, which was started similarly at a meeting of sharecroppers that were considering striking for higher wages, and some of the henchmen, I guess, of the landlord showed up, and somebody fired a gun, and then a bunch of the sharecroppers were killed, and then following that, mostly the sharecroppers were arrested and convicted of having of having caused the massacre, even though they were the ones being massacred. But an eventual later case, the NAACP and ACLU get involved, and they are later exonerated. But it's got a long legal story there. But I think Elaine is probably the biggest example and the most well-known example of the violence that was coming out of this sharecropping system in the Delta, okay? So that's before the Great Depression. And then the Great Depression adds fuel to the fire, right? Three things happened very close together. First, there was the 1927 flood, which flooded 50 counties in Arkansas and destroyed crops and destroyed a lot of farms, okay? Then in 1930-31, there was a major drought, which again caused farms to fail. And then bank failures throughout the South and around the country made it impossible for farmers to get credit to build back from this, right? And also caused general economic instability, high prices, a depression, those sorts of things, right? So this system, which had already been violent and close to boiling over, now a lot of what money was in there is pulled out. So the federal government responds in several ways, right? One of them, the Federal Emergency Relief Act, found ice nearby, right? But in 1933, the Agricultural Adjustment Act, what it did was it paid farmers to plow under one of every 3 rows of cotton, and it would pay you for the cotton in order to control the supply in the market, right? Well, what many landowners did, this work is being done by tenant farmers and by sharecroppers, but the check's coming to the landlord. And what the landlord would do is keep the money and not distribute it, right, to those farmers. And in many cases, they evicted farmers and turned them into day laborers so that they wouldn't be eligible for the payments, right? And it is those actions in Poinsett County, specifically the actions connected to the Agricultural Adjustment Act, that led sharecroppers to unionize. So we have a picture there of H.L. Mitchell's dry cleaners, and right next door to that is Clay East, his service station. He had a Lion service station there. And Mitchell and East helped organize this union, and their buildings there in Tyronza on the kind of the Main Street storefront became the headquarters, the first headquarters for the union, and that's now where our site is located. Socialist Party leader, National Socialist Party leader Norman Thomas is the one who suggested to them that the correct response to take would be to form a union. So 1934, 18 men, 11 white and 7 black came together just outside at the Fairview Plantation, just outside of Tyronza, and formed the Southern Tenant Farmers Union. And then it moved back, it set up headquarters in the businesses there back on Main Street in Tyronza. It wasn't there very long. Because of the threats of violence, the union had to move pretty quickly, within a year, to downtown Memphis, where the city government offered them protection if they were to move there. So Mitchell and East continued to be involved well after that, as did many Poinsett County, original Poinsett County members and folks from around Arkansas, but the official headquarters moved to Memphis. So, what came of the union? Well, they did have some successful collective action. They had a couple of strikes in the late 30s and early 40s that did increase the wages that were per pound of cotton for the sharecroppers. Mostly, though, their collective action wasn't especially successful. They were, after they got started and after the landlords saw, kind of what their methods were, they were much more able to put down future strikes and that sort of thing, right? But they were important in other ways. First of all, the model of integrated membership was a generation ahead of its time, right? And the idea that sharecroppers, both black and white, were facing similar challenges and could work together to confront those challenges, whereas the landowners frequently used a racial divide to keep collective action from happening, right? So this was an example of what could be possible, right? And also, since this is a generation earlier, many future leaders, both in the civil rights struggle in Arkansas, but then also in the larger national farm labor movement, got their start in the Southern Tenant Farmers Museum, or Union, Southern Tenant Farmers Union. The museum's what we call it now. Another example of one of the members of the museum, this is John Hancock, who was a musician and wrote many of the ballads of the Union, including Mean Thing Happening in This Land, Mean Things Happening in This Land, which is a song that was later made popular by Pete Seeger, but is also the name that Hancock chose for his memoirs, right? But there are other songs. "Roll the Union On," for an example, is another one. He's a very interesting figure. And you can see this is Alice Smith Monroe, who was one of the members of the Union here, and she's one that continues to be involved in the farm labor movement throughout the country in future years, and you can see her here out in California with working with the Union there. I have one last quote, and this is from FDR about the Southern Tenant Farmers Union. 5 years ago, out of revolt and vision, the Southern Tenant Farmers Union was born. Its members and leaders, white and Negro, have risked their lives to build their union. Today, it embodies the hope of the disinherited. Okay, so that's the end of my presentation. I just want to say, though, that if any of these sites are of interest to you, they are, besides the work we do with research and with students, they are also open to the public. And we enjoy having visitors, so please come and see us at any of the 4 sites. Thank you. Yeah, so we have, and there are still some families. There are still some families around. There aren't many because farms got bigger, right? So 20-acre farms didn't last. But we have very good records of the original 487 families. Over time, some of them sold, new people moved in. But of those original families, we have a database open to the public there where you can follow your family name, and then we have all the genealogical and property information that we have, including pictures, family trees, whatever. For some families, we have a lot of that. In some families, we have barely anything. It just we have at least the names and the house style for all of the original colonists, but we add as we get it. Yes, all the families at Dice were white. There was another resettlement colony that was segregated down. I forget the name of it, but there's no physical evidence of it left.
Were all the families at Dice from somewhere in Arkansas?
Yes, they were all Kansans, yes.
Okay, one more question. Mm-hmm. I'd like to know a little bit more about John Hancock's background in life.
Yeah, he joined the Union as a young man. At the time, he's probably I want to say 18 or 20 when he joins the Union. He did come from an agricultural background, but I don't know many of the specifics. And then following that, really the union work kind of dominated his life. He continued with the Southern Tenant Farmers Museum, and then with other agricultural unions, and then one of the, if you want to see a performance of his, one to look for is Seeger performing Mean Things Happening in This Land at the Kennedy Center, and he brings Hancock's on stage to perform it with him. So, yes, I believe so. Yeah.
Any more questions? I'm sure there are. Okay, let's move to the closest person. I'm sorry.
In Dias, it sounds like it was a big social experiment in a way. Was the government involved much in like farming practices and control of what kind of crops they did and how they grew them?
Initially, yes. Initially, the government was very involved in the decisions they made on the farm, what crops, how they grew them, that sort of thing. That only lasted a few years, and then the federal influence kind of backs off, and then after that, they pretty much, run as any other small town farms would, probably starting in about the time of World War II.
I have a historical comment today. When the museum first opened, what is now Monroe, were printed in big letters STFU. And this was the highlight of every child's trip to get their picture taken under STFU. Being delicate ears here, I will not explain what the kids all do.
Yeah.
All right, she really asked me to say to you, shut the fuck up!
Yeah, that's why I made a point that we say STFM. That's what all our signs say now. We learned from the past.
So I recently visited the Dodds Hall
Okay. Yeah.
because my grandparents, our grandparents, were recipients of New Deal property in Clover Bend.
Okay.
And fantastic time. I also came to see Blunt's to be Morris.
Oh, okay. Sure.
And I pull up your
Yeah, absolutely.
Trout Fishing in America will perform on the porch of the Johnny Cash Boyhood Home.
On August 20th?
And listen, I take a day off work on Saturday, like today, and I drive over and visit Lecanto and Dias and go to the pylons. I could go back days and days and days, and even the art exhibit at the administration building. I just met the most wonderful people, and someone You probably go back and dig deeper. It's just such a great, wonderful heritage to embrace and love. Thank you.
Yeah, well, thank you for that. And let me say, if you come to that concert, the concert's free and it starts at 5 that afternoon. But because it's on the front porch of the house, we don't have the house open for tours during the concert. So our last tour that day will go out at 3. So just if you come, we'll hope you'll also come early enough where you can see the site.
It's like my father was born in 1895, served in World War I. But in the 1920s, he got married and had a family, and they lived in the Caraway area. I was a tenant farmer, or some kind of farmer. He didn't own anything. They lived for some weeks on one of the levees over there during the 1927 flood. And then later, he got a farm at Clover Bend, just outside the thing they have over there. I was born there in 46. But he had a lot of stories to tell about life in and around Caraway and all the things that went on there.
Sure. Yeah, and Clover Bend is another one of the resettlement colonies. Dice is the largest one in the country for agriculture. What's that? And the first. Yeah, it was colony number 1, but then its original administrator, William Dice, died in a plane crash, so they named it after him. But there are also colonies around the country for resettling other workers. So there's like mining colonies and factory-based colonies and stuff. So they weren't all agricultural either. Yeah.
So I'm curious about what time of year that 1927 flood happened. I assume it was in the spring, but in recent times we've had floods during December. So when did it occur?
That's a good question. I don't know. I assume it was in the spring, but I guess I don't know. Anybody know?
Was it the same construction firm or architect involved in the building that now houses the Southern Tenant Farmers Union as it was as the store in Scott that is now the visitor center for Plantation Agriculture Agency, because they resemble each other precisely.
Yeah, so I don't know for certain, but I know that the way that things were built in Dice is they were shipped in by train and assembled there in Dice, and so they were sent from some federal, hub out by train and then assembled there. So I think it's very likely that could be probably not assembled by the same people, right? But the same sort of kit on the same plan. Or a similar architect, yeah. It's a good question.
I'll ask you one more.
He has a booming voice, so he doesn't.
Yeah.
Lakeport Plantation, the area there, I'm curious as to whether or not the local black population was very happy. How did they take the reconstruction of this antebellum building?
Right. Well, we expected when we started doing oral histories at Lakeport to find that many of the families that became sharecroppers had, descended from the enslaved laborers at Lakeport. But actually what we found is during the earlier, there was another major flood of the Mississippi in the 1890s, and that a lot of the families that descended from the enslaved laborers at Lakeport moved north during that flood. And then later families moved in from Alabama and Mississippi and became sharecroppers there at Lakeport. So they have been open to sharing their stories of the years of sharecropping and the years when their families were there, but they our initial assumption that they were, related to the enslaved laborers at Lakeport it ended up not being true, and they knew that, but we just went into it making assumptions. So, yeah.
I checked it. Black River at Black Rock crested April 15th.
April 15th. Okay, thank you. Yeah. Easy to remember.